Hello, this is the lecture for European history for Friday, the 5th of October, 2021. The Edwardian Era is described by the reign of King Edward VII of the United Kingdom and the British Empire. But though he reigned from 1901 until around 1911, 1912 when he died, it is more broadly applicable to the period leading up to World War I, which begins in 1914. So I'm using that term. Now, during this period of time, the German Colossus looms over everything in European policy, in the colonial policies of the empires, in military policy, in economics. The Germans have overtaken the British in terms of steel production and heavy industry, and they are outstripping the British with more modern factories on a larger scale. And in general terms, the unified German Empire of this period, because of the Ruhr Valley industrial region and because of its well-educated and well-disciplined population, and because of its relatively advanced culture and society, are really, in many ways, in a position to dominate at least the European mainland between Britain and Russia, and maybe more. Now, how do the Germans handle this? Well, if it wasn't for their emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, they might have approached this period of strength with some degree of grace and humility that might have put the other nations of Europe at ease, made them less afraid of what Germany was capable of doing. If you happen to be big and strong, or wealthy and powerful, or in any way, in some important fashion, superior to the people around you in terms of some force, you can either lord it over them, scare the bejesus out of them, or recognize that no matter how you behave, you're going to make them nervous because of the power imbalance. So sometimes people who are in that strong position try to act especially calm, especially measured. They don't allow themselves to become ruffled. They don't act out of anger. They don't bluster and bluff. They are the strong, silent type. They don't need to bluster and bluff because they are powerful in this situation. However, the personality of Kaiser Wilhelm II is just the wrong man at the wrong place in the wrong moment of history. Kaiser Wilhelm is impetuous. He is impulsive. He is aggressive. He overcompensates for any feelings of inferiority or weakness that his withered arm might have presented him, or his feelings that he has to somehow catch up to his British grandmother's nation and overtake them in every area. This hunger for glory and drama and meaning. It didn't come from a bad place. Kaiser Bill was not an evil man, even though he has a funky mustache, and so does the Austrian corporal who leads Germany in the Second World War. They're very, very, very different men. Wilhelm is not an evil man. However, Wilhelm is not a particularly mature man. He sees Germany as coming late to the party of industrial European power. In the colonial field, in the naval field, in the industrial field, But he also sees Germany overtaking Britain industrially. And he expects that what this will do is help Germany overtake Britain in most every other way. And that is important to him. He likes getting reactions from people, whether it's by pushing his friends and courtiers off the royal yacht when he's on vacation and laughing, or whether it's arriving in Morocco during a crisis over whether Morocco will go independent or become French or Spanish or German. Wilhelm likes not only the realities of power as an emperor and as the emperor of the single most powerful country, certainly between Britain and Russia, and maybe in all of Europe, depending upon how and when you measure it. He likes the feeling of being the most important person in any room he's in, the most powerful person. He says things like when he's on a trip to Switzerland and he's watching the Swiss army maneuvers, and he just happens to say to the president of Switzerland, you know, this is impressive, but what would you guys do if something happened and suddenly my vast army invaded your little country? Wouldn't that be something? And the president of Switzerland looks over at him and says, yes, it would. See these mountains? We know them. You don't. See all the people? All of the men, all of them are armed. They all have regular military training. The male population of the entire country can be conscripted for war at a moment's notice. Not even Germany did that. Wilhelm backed off. Now, what's important to me in this story isn't so much that Switzerland managed to back the Germans off of being aggressive to them. The fact is, the money laundering that the Swiss banking system does for leaders around the world who want to hide their ill-gotten gains made Switzerland largely immune to invasion as much as any geographical or military factor. What's important to me in this story is how Wilhelm felt the need to say something so obnoxious. Wouldn't it be a shame if my army came and conquered your country? On some level, he was comfortable saying that. The Emperor of Germany, not just some guy in a bar drinking beer and talking big, the Emperor of Germany on a state visit felt comfortable, casually threatening the existence of his hosts as an independent nation. Wilhelm's personality is a serious problem. He wants Germany to be strong. He wants to be a good emperor. He has good intentions. He also sees Germany as more progressive than the British and French, even though the British have a functioning parliamentary system and the French have a republic. Because the Germans have the most advanced welfare state, the most advanced system of social security, unemployment insurance, and so forth. He sees Anglo-Saxon capitalism as practiced in Britain and the United States as being heartless because the workers are at the mercy of the employers. And he doesn't see the reforms that have happened in Britain and France that mitigate this to some extent. He sees the German system of government intervention in the economy as being superior to a genuine free market because it cares for all members of society. In other words, the emperor had some, don't tell anyone, socialist or social democratic in him. He had some ideas that are in harmony with socialism and social democracy. Now, it's only to an extent, but he really did believe that because Germany had these social programs and the West didn't have them to the same munificent degree, that Germany was ahead and Germany had something to teach the rest of the world. When Wilhelm sang the national anthem, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, Germany, Germany overall, he meant it. He meant it. And again, his personality would cause international crises. The worst example of this is as regards naval affairs. Like everyone else of his generation, Kaiser Wilhelm read, studied, and believed in the thesis of Alfred Thayer Mahan in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Wilhelm read and believed that only with a battle fleet of heavy warships could a nation win a decisive battle at sea, and because of that victory, take command of the seas, which involves also taking control of oceanic trade. Now, Bismarck had tried explaining, Germany is not Britain. Germany is a continental European power whose strength comes from its army and, to a lesser degree, its factories. Bismarck sees this. He doesn't even want an empire. Despite that, various pro-imperialist forces in Germany during Bismarck's era actually managed to claim territory in Africa and Asia and the Pacific. Bismarck doesn't really want it. Wilhelm does. He wants Germany to have a place in the sun. And he wants really for a German empire to overtake the biggest empire in human history, the British Empire, in his lifetime. And because he wants this, and because he does not want his English relatives to lord over him their command of the sea, and therefore dominance over world trade, the world economy, and the world in general, Wilhelm teams up with a naval enthusiast, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, and starts building a new German navy. This choice is going to have massive repercussions, and we will get back to it later in the lectures. Looking to see, no, we won't. I'll get to it right now. In the 1890s, the German Imperial Navy, the Kaiserliche Marine, is in the early 1890s, small coastal defense force designed to protect Germany's northern shore facing the North Sea and facing the Baltic Sea. And frankly, the geography of those coastlines, which have massive tidal flats and very limited ports, make it easier for Germany to not have to worry too much about being invaded in an amphibious attack from the north. But in the mid to late 1890s, Kaiser Wilhelm and Admiral von Tirpitz begin passing through the Reichstag, the German parliament, a series of navy laws that are designed to build a first-class battle fleet. Now, the Germans are behind the British. They don't have the shipyards yet. They don't have the know-how yet to build the kind of massive battleship guns, 12 inches in diameter bullets that they shoot out, that the British do. But the only way they're going to learn is by doing. And as they learn their trade, it becomes apparent that because Germany's shipyards are newer than the British, and because the Germans are learning a new craft, they're being innovative in a way that the British aren't always. So suddenly the British in the late 1890s and very, very early 1900s begin noticing that the German Navy is building up, and that the Kaiser is talking about having a high seas fleet, second to none. Second to none? That means second to none, including the British Royal Navy. Germany needs its army. It does not need its navy. Britain needs its navy. It's an island nation with a dispersed maritime empire spanning the globe. It regulates global trade. It fights piracy. It stops the slave trade. It does all sorts of things around the world. Britain at this time is the world's policeman. And it is able to do this because its navy is as powerful as the next two most powerful navies. That's the law in Britain in the 1880s and early 1890s, that Britain's Royal Navy will have more battleships than the next two most powerful navies combined. But with Germany and its new, incredibly modern and growing steel industry that's eclipsing Britain's steel industry, and you need steel to build battleships, the German Navy begins rising in rank, and its ships are new, and this challenges Britain. Then in 1906, everything changes. The British Royal Navy builds a new type of warship, His Majesty's ship Dreadnought. Now, up to this time, a battleship had 4 12-inch guns, 2 facing forward, 2 facing aft, on swiveling turrets, and a bunch of secondary armament of maybe 6-inch guns. The Dreadnought is faster than any battleship at that time at 18.5 knots in terms of speed. It's more well-armored than any battleship up to this point in time. Its engines are not reciprocating piston engines. It is steam turbine engines, which is a forerunner of the jet. And instead of having 4 12-inch guns and a bunch of 6-inch secondary armament, it dispenses with the secondary armament entirely and instead has 12 12-inch guns. HMS Dreadnought is therefore as powerful as from 4 to 6 other battleships just on its own. This style of warship is going to be called a dreadnought. There's a lighter version with the same firepower but less armor, called a battle cruiser, that the British will also pioneer. With the launching and commissioning of His Majesty's ship Dreadnought, HMS Dreadnought, every other warship in the world is rendered obsolete. Navies are going to have to rebuild with dreadnought battleships. And that means that the advantage that Britain had in old-style pre-dreadnought battleships doesn't matter, because pre-dreadnought battleships have just been outmoded, like biplanes in World War II were outmoded. All the armored cruisers of the old navies were also outclassed by Britain's battle cruisers, so they needed to be replaced too. But this new navy that Britain starts of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers gives an opportunity to Germany to get into the dreadnought race on the ground floor in a big way, so that the Germans can build up a modern fleet, and if they can keep up with the British or have an advantage in quality over the British, Suddenly, the new navies of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers will not have this massive superiority of British over German. They'll be much more equivalent, and Germany might actually take command of the seas as well as of the land. It's conceivable. Now, because Wilhelm II is Wilhelm II, he doesn't think twice about this. He doesn't think what effect this is going to have on the other nations of Europe. He doesn't think how much this is going to scare the other nations of Europe. He doesn't think about what this will do to British public opinion. He assumes that that'll all take care of itself because Germany overall in the world. So Wilhelm orders full steam ahead on the construction of the Kaiserlich Marine's high seas fleet. They challenge the British, dreadnought for dreadnought, battle cruiser for battle cruiser. Now, at first, no one knows how that's going to go, because in some ways the German ships are technologically more advanced. Their armor is better. Their fire control systems, with optics produced by the Zeiss optics company, which makes some of the world's best telescopes and binoculars today, is better. Its shells, in some respects, are better at armor piercing. The British tend to be bigger, faster ships, firing much bigger guns, but not as well armored, and without having as much quality in each shell that's fired, just volume. And at first, no one knows how this is going to go. The British don't want to spend money on an entirely new battle fleet. They've invested the last century and more on slowly building up and keeping ahead of their neighbors, and now all of a sudden, instead of continuing their slow build of pre-dreadnoughts, because they launched a ship so far advanced in advance of every other ship, the British now realize they're in a dreadnought race with Germany. And so suddenly British Navy spending goes through the roof because they cannot afford to let the Germans get ahead in dreadnoughts and battle cruisers. Now, the British had already been irritated by Wilhelm and his colonial interferences and his building up of a pre-dreadnought navy. In fact, Wilhelm had set the stage for Germany's defeat in World War II as early as the first years of his reign, in the early 1890s. Why? At the heart of Bismarck's foreign policy was to keep France isolated, not to let France make any alliance with any other country. Britain, in the mid to late 1800s, was in a period of what they called splendid isolation. They were not going to involve themselves in European affairs and get tied down in an alliance with anyone. And they didn't need to in those days because they were so much stronger than everyone else. The key to Bismarck's success is what's called the Dreikaiserbund, the Three Emperors League. The Three Emperors League was the league of the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, or Kaiser, Franz Joseph, the German Emperor, Wilhelm I, and then, for a brief time, Wilhelm II, and the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II. Actually, Tsar Alexander III, before Nicholas. By keeping Germany, the German Empire, Russia, the Russian Empire, and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in an alliance, Bismarck secures Germany's eastern frontier. The Germans don't have to worry about if France goes to war over Alsace-Lorraine or for revanche the Germans don't have to worry about their backs because allies are in the east. So Germany can launch its full strength against France in the west. So long as the Dreikaiserbund, the Three Emperors League, is in force, Germany is secure, France is isolated, and everything's going to be fine. But there are alarm bells when Wilhelm II becomes emperor and dismisses Bismarck. Because Wilhelm doesn't want to hold back. And the Russians and the Austrians are constantly making trouble for one another. In the southeastern peninsula of Europe, north of Greece, called the Balkans. This area, north of Greek and Turkish lands around the Aegean Sea, stretches through what is now Bulgaria, Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Romania, and the Transylvania region of Hungary in those days. That region of southeastern Europe is where Austria's imperial ambitions have been marching south for several hundred years. The Austrians and then later the Austro-Hungarians take more and more and more of the Balkans. However, in the Balkans, there are relatives of the Russians. The Russian people are Slavic. They are Slavs. It is an ethnic group of Eastern Europeans. Poles are Slavs, the Lithuanians are Slavs, the Russians are Slavs, the White Russians or Belarusians are Slavs, the Serbians are Slavs, the Bulgarians are Slavs. The Slavic peoples of the East share certain cultural traits in common, and they share certain historical experiences in common, and many of the Slavs, like the Serbians and the Russians, are Eastern Orthodox Christians. They are not from the Western Catholic tradition or Protestant traditions. They are Eastern Orthodox Christians. Because of this, the Russians do not want the Serbs to come under Austrian control. And so the Dreikaiserbund in its later years has seen a lot of friction because the Austrians are expanding towards the Serbs with every intention of taking them over, and the Russians are stretching their hands out to little Slavic brothers. So, what to do? Wilhelm takes sides. Wilhelm joins with Austria because Austria is ruled by fellow Germans and because the Russians are just too irritating. Bismarck found a way to keep things working with the Three Emperors League, but Wilhelm II scraps it, throws it out, makes a tighter alliance with Austria, and lets the Russians go their own way. And what this is going to result in 1894, when Tsar Nicholas II becomes emperor of Russia, is that the French and the Russians, polar opposites politically, the French have a republic, the Third French Republic. The Russians have the most autocratic empire in Europe. They make the Germans and Austrians look like liberal progressives. These two countries, one Roman Catholic and secularizing, the other Russian Orthodox, one largely industrial and modern, the other still with most of its people living just like they did back in the Middle Ages. France and Russia come together. They come together in an alliance. Thank you, Wilhelm. What you've done is you have allowed what Bismarck wanted to prevent at all costs. If there's a war involving the French in the West, the Russians will march to their aid from the East and Germany will have to fight on both its eastern and western frontiers in a two-front war, dividing its strength and making it much harder to win anywhere. That's bad. And that is an unforced error that happens right away in Wilhelm's realm. Alarm. But Wilhelm's not alarmed, because the Russians seem backward and the French seem, well, French, disorganized, emotional, but not very serious, not very dangerous. However, because of the Dreadnought Race, actually because of the pre-Dreadnought Race, because of Germany's naval laws and its naval expansion, and because Germany continues interfering around the edges of the British Empire, particularly during the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, where they sent weapons to the Boers, where they gave encouragement to the Boers. And remember, this is the bloodiest war that Britain has experienced in over half a century. They don't like the Germans because of this. A new Entente cordial agreement, is set up between France and Britain. Because Germany wants a navy and is messing with Britain's empire, the British feel threatened enough to want to join with France, its natural enemy in Western Europe, and its biggest colonial opponent. The French and the British have up to this point competed with one another. That's now going to change. They come up with an agreement that settles their colonial disputes. And throughout the past 100 years, Britain and Russia have struggled over where British India stops and southern Russian Kazakhstan starts. And they fought over Afghanistan and other places along the Asian, Himalayan, Afghani, Iranian frontier. The British and the Russians have nasty history. The British and the French have nasty history. The French and the Russians have nothing in common, except all three of these groups are afraid of Germany. They are threatened by Wilhelm, his industrial power, his economic power, his army's power, and now his growing navy's power. Wilhelm, by being bullying, provokes what becomes the Triple Entente, which is the triple agreement between Britain, France, and Russia. And it is aimed at Germany. If Germany launches a war of aggression, the Triple Entente is going to be ready to stop it. Now, Germany, in response, sets up what is called the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance involves Germany, Austria-Hungary, and eventually Italy. Russia, a country that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, with relatively unlimited manpower and natural resources. The British Empire, the largest empire in human history, with India, and the French, who have, at this point, the second largest empire, and are in the west of Germany. Okay, that's the Triple Entente. You have Germany, the most powerful single country in Europe, at the head of the Triple Alliance. Then you've got the Austrians. The Austrians aren't strong enough to hold their empire without caving to Hungarian demands. And that's what creates Austria-Hungary. So now you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is divided against itself. It is a multicultural quilt. And the thing about multicultural polyglot empires is they don't get along within themselves. Austria is not comfortable within its own skin. It's an empire ready to explode apart into the flames of nationalist ambitions. Italy? Italy, like Germany, is a new nation, but unlike Germany, Italy is having difficulty industrializing, and it only industrializes in the north, around Milan and Venice. in North Italy, in the Po River Valley. So Italy is weak. Italy also has real divisions between North and South, and there isn't much national power there. So yeah, you've got in Germany and the German Empire, the strongest nation in all of Europe, but Austria is a basket case and Italy's a basket case. Still, thanks to the German ideas of, thanks to the German strength and the characteristics of Kaiser Wilhelm's personality, we now have two alliances that dominate the great powers of Europe. And what these alliances do is they heighten the tensions. Because at this point, you're not going to have another Franco-Prussian War, or another Crimean War, or another limited war at all. If any of the six powers in these alliances is provoked to fight, they are all going to be involved on day one, or within the first few weeks. That means that the alliance system has both sides ready to start a general war, which is the very thing that Metternich at the Congress of Vienna wanted to avoid at all costs, another general war. But thanks to the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, warfare in one part of Europe will immediately consume the entire continent. So, that's bad. Here's what's worse. Everyone studies the Franco-Prussian War. Why? Because it's a decisive German victory. The German states, led by Prussia, cut through France's armies like a hot knife through butter, and they extort a peace that gives them Alsace-Lorraine and a big indemnity. And the empire falls, and the Paris Commune rises and falls, and eventually the Third Republic rises. Okay. This is how warfare should be. Quick, decisive, not a long drawn-out affair. And so everyone begins imitating the Prussian General Staff system, and now the German General Staff system. And what they also learn from the Franco-Prussian War, which is going to overshadow all of their thinking up to the First World War, more than the American Civil War, more than the Anglo-Boer War, because the American Civil War is fought in that half-frontier land of the United States and the Confederate States, and the Boer War is a colonial war. So the European thinkers don't take that into account. They don't take into account the lessons of the Civil War, which are really foreshadowings of what World War I will be like. Or the lessons of the Anglo-Boer War, which also have a lot to tell. Now, they're looking at the quick campaigns of von Moltke and Bismarck and the glory that was the German victory over France. So, every one of these general staff systems in Germany, in Austria, in Russia, in France, in Britain, in Italy, what they all plan for is a German-style 1870 attack, just like happened in the Franco-Prussian War. In fact, they believe that the attack is the most important part of war. You never win a war by defending. So why bother defending? Attack! 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 So all of these armies have war plans that involve deploying their troops onto enemy soil right away. The French have their Plan 17, which is an attack through the Vosges Mountains of Alsace-Lorraine towards the Rhine River. The Russians are going to attack into East Prussia. The Austrians are going to attack south into Serbia. And the Germans are developing a battle plan when the Franco-Prussian War, when the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5 explodes. And what do the Germans conclude about the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War? That Russia is a basket case, incapable of defeating the Yellow Peril, as the Europeans racialists call the Japanese. The Russians can't stand up to a newly civilized, the Germans say, Oriental power. And if they can't stand up to the Japanese, they certainly can't stand up to the German army. So the Germans are not going to take the Russian threat to their eastern border that seriously. Count von Schlieffen, who is the head of the German General Staff at this time, comes up with a battle plan whose simplicity is able to be explained like I'm about to. Very limited forces are going to be placed in the east along the Russian frontier. These forces are not even designed to stop the Russians. They're designed to confuse them and slow them down. The Russians in the Russo-Japanese War prove that their army is slow, ponderous, old-fashioned, and will take weeks or months to deploy. So they'll have time in the east to just have a guard force that'll slow down and confuse the Russian battle plans. Meanwhile, in the west, the vast majority of Germany's strength is going to be gathered from the Swiss border to the border of the North Sea with Holland, and along the border with France through the Vosges Mountains and the border of Luxembourg, which is a tiny little border and a tiny little country, and the German border with Belgium and the German border with Holland. German troops are going to deploy. The plan is that they are going to march through Holland and Belgium in a wheeling movement north of Paris, with their backs scraping the North Sea coast and the coast of the English Channel. Only when they get north of Paris will they swing around and cut Paris off and envelop it. The French will have all their strength in the south trying to attack through Alsace-Lorraine, and the Germans will wheel south, surround and take over Paris, and win the war. That is the Schlieffen Plan. It places no less than 80 to 85% of Germany's army resources into this wheeling attack. And that's the plan. That's the plan. So if war comes, not only will all of Europe be involved, but that every European country will immediately attack, which is going to up the body count, up the intensity, and make it harder and harder for the Europeans to step back from the fighting, to the point where it's almost psychologically impossible. Now, the last thing I'm going to say today is about how armies function at this time. With the exception of Britain, the European powers have what's called conscription, male conscription. It's a draft. Most men serve a short time, a year or 2 or 3, in the army active forces. And they do this between ages 18 and 20, roughly. So they serve with the forces in their late teens and early 20s, and then they join what's called the active reserve. And the active reserve, several times a year, gets together, make sure their equipment is good, make sure the information is all there, promotes anyone that needs to be promoted, go through physical training, and at least once a year they go on maneuvers. As if they're going to be fighting a war with the regular forces. Then say when they turn 35, these active reserve go on the inactive reserve, where they are until they're in their 40s or 50s. So you've got 18 to 20-year-olds, all with the active forces. Then you've got a massive reserve of people from 21 to 33, 34, or 35 that are in the active reserve that can join the regulars very quickly. And then you've got the inactive reserve of older men that you can pull from if you need to. Plus, if the war is long, younger cohorts will come in to the full regular army. Now, everyone except Britain does this. Britain does not have conscription. It has, like we do today, a totally volunteer army. So the British army, qualitatively man for man, is better than any army in the world at this time. Even the Germans. But the Germans have the second highest quality army in the world. And it's massive. They've got a few 100,000 men in the active services. But within 2 weeks, they can have 2 million men in the field. Within a couple of months, another 2 million men. So the German army can surge from 300,000 to 2 to 4 million men very, very quickly. This system requires what is called mobilization. And what mobilization is activating the active reserves, calling them to arms, having them go to their armories, equip themselves, organize themselves, and get on the train. The step before the attack, like cocking back the hammer of a revolver before you shoot it, is called mobilization. You have your active forces deploying on trains, because trains are the way soldiers are moved in those days. And then you've got the active reserve coming from their civilian lives and taking up arms and taking places on trains. So, in mobilization, you suddenly have a vast number of men, and the entire national rail network is devoted to, and road network is devoted to getting these troops towards the enemy as part of the attack plan. But what nobody notices, outside of the high commands, and what politicians fail to register, is that the German mobilization plan involves putting troops on Belgian soil on day 2 or day 3. That the other battle plans involve, as part of mobilization, moving troops onto other countries' land. And what that means is that mobilization equals war, because when you put army forces on another country's soil, that's an act of war. But what the politicians believe is that mobilization, like cocking the hammer of a revolver back and letting it sit there, is a step that you can take to threaten your enemies, like brandishing a gun before war, short of war. That mobilization does not equal war. The result of this misunderstanding, that mobilization equals war, that it's not a separate click back, hold your finger on the trigger and threaten somebody. It is a single, smooth motion that you cannot pull back without. The politicians think they can pull back without, but they can't. It's always mobilization equals war. And that misunderstanding is going to cost the world mightily. When we come back next week to talk about the outbreak of the First World War. Remember, I would expect that lecture to take Monday, and that your unit exam, 3B, on Romanticism, nationalism, European imperialism, and the Belle Epoque and the origins of World War I is going to be on Tuesday. Also, I believe you have a unit survey due Monday. Have a good weekend. Bon chance. Good luck. Get some rest, and I'll see you Monday, God willing.